Hi everyone, we are the Pecha Kucha Group 12, and today we'll be discussing algorithmic bias and the ethics behind it. In March of 2016, Microsoft designed a chatbot, Tay, that was tasked with engaging with young adults on Twitter. Its first whimsical tweet was, "Hello world," but in just 12 hours, it transformed into an expletive-laden, racist and sexist Holocaust denier. What happened? In Tay's case, 4chan users inundated the bot with highly offensive tweets, and Tay quickly learned from the behavior of Twitter users it engaged with, as it was programmed to do. This was a clear example of algorithmic bias when seemingly innocuous programming takes on the prejudices of either its creators or the data it is fed. Algorithmic bias describes systematic and repeatable errors in a computer system that create unfair outcomes, such as privileging or excluding based on race, gender, religion, etc. Discriminatory algorithms, whether intentional or unintentional, have long existed since the advent of computing. Computer systems can be biased based on how they're developed and how they're ultimately used. Yes, humans are error-prone and can be prejudiced, but that doesn't mean that algorithms are necessarily better because the biases of humans can be inherently present in them. As Professor Oppenheimer at UC Berkeley puts it, even if algorithms are not designed with the intent of discriminating against those groups, if they reproduce social preferences even in a completely rational way, they will also reproduce those forms of discrimination. Google image search has long been notorious for discriminating against and stereotyping against peoples of color and women. Searches for black women and other female peoples of color are often sexualized or commercialized. And one viral video in 2016 displayed that searches for black teens are criminalized, whereas those for white teens are depicted as wholesome and all-American. Google, of course, responded that these search results were anomalous and beyond its control. But systematic blind spots are not just deeply offensive, however. While examples of Tay the Twitter bot and Google image search discrimination are highly disturbing, algorithmic bias can also have crucial real-world impact for society. They can reinforce social biases of gender and race and serve to perpetuate long-standing inequalities. We will explore fields like healthcare and policing, but algorithmic bias can have important implications for all aspects of everyday life.
So the first example we're going to look at is algorithmic bias in healthcare. Algorithms have many different uses in healthcare, a primary one being for care allocation. A 2019 study led by Ziad Obermeyer at UC Berkeley examined one widely used care allocation algorithm in U.S. hospitals, used to determine what patients receive what type of care given their specific needs and the circumstances of resources at the hospital. So, in order to determine which patients receive which care, the algorithm gave a health risk score to each patient, and Black people were generally determined to have lower health risk scores than white people, despite the fact that Black patients were generally much sicker than their white counterparts due to a higher prevalence of chronic illnesses like diabetes and high blood pressure, as shown in these figures. So the health risk scores determined by the algorithms were biased. The cause of the algorithmic bias is that the cost of healthcare was an important variable used by the algorithms. Healthcare costs for Black patients are much less annually, about $1,800 less annually than white patients. But this is due to the general reduced access of healthcare as a result of systemic racism in the healthcare industry, rather than better health outcomes of Black patients. In fact, Black patients have worse health outcomes despite spending less. So, what causes systemic racism in healthcare? Systemic racism in healthcare is manifested in the distrust of the healthcare system, doctors, and poor experience with staff. It also is caused by discrimination from healthcare providers, and a catalytic incident can cause prolonged patient-physician mistrust, which manifests in poor access to healthcare resources. So the conclusions from this study were that an increase from 17.6% to 46.5% of Black patients would have received additional care through an unbiased algorithm. An unbiased algorithm would be based solely on biomarkers. The authors of the study have been working to address this issue by offering pro bono consultation to healthcare providers and leadership. So this photo is of one of the authors, Syed Obermeyer.
Beyond bias in Google searches, algorithmic bias also influences high-stakes sectors such as law enforcement. Algorithms are becoming more and more widely used in multiple areas of law enforcement, including predictive policing and algorithms that help judges determine sentences. As a concept, such uses of AI seem useful. Predictive policing could help prevent crimes before they happen, but in practice, these tools end up being very harmful to already marginalized communities. One predictive policing algorithm called PredPol, which is used widely across the United States, uses crime data to predict the locations and times of potential crimes. Police are able to use this information to identify which areas they should patrol more, with the goal of preventing crimes before they happen. But this leads to a staggering racial and socioeconomic bias in which areas end up being most heavily policed, as areas with historically high crime rates oftentimes have high populations of people of color. Another example of a biased algorithm is called correctional offender management profiling for alternative sanctions, which is used by many judges across the country. It rates defendants on a scale of 1 to 10 using metrics to determine how likely they are to be rearrested in the future if released. But the issue is that the algorithm makes these determinations based off of the demographic data of previous defendants, and Black Americans have historically been treated unfairly by our justice system, which has skewed the data to reflect this racial bias. A 2016 study exposed the heavily flawed nature of Compass. It found that individuals determined to be at high risk of reoffense, but who didn't actually commit a crime within 2 years were much more likely to be Black, while individuals determined to be at low risk of reoffense, but did commit a crime within 2 years were much more likely to be white. This demonstrates how algorithms end up reproducing racial inequalities within the justice system. The key issue with these algorithms is not that they use race. Legally, such algorithms are not allowed to explicitly use race as a factor, but in using socioeconomically biased factors such as zip code and education level, race becomes an implicit factor. In this way, it's difficult to eliminate bias from these algorithms when the available data is already inherently biased.
So in terms of possible solutions to lessen or eliminate algorithmic bias, the most obvious or straightforward solution would be to utilize more representative datasets. Machine learning algorithms are trained using large datasets, and a lot of the data that is used is old and biased, which leads to the algorithm performing poorly on newer, more representative data. For example, if a facial recognition algorithm is trained using a dataset containing primarily white faces, it probably won't be able to accurately recognize darker skin tones. But the issue with building more representative datasets is that efforts to do so aren't always ethical. In 2019, Google reportedly used deceptive tactics to target people with darker skin in order to gather data to make their facial recognition software better. Workers who were sent out to collect facial scans were told specifically to target people with darker skin tones, and they sometimes persuaded subjects to consent to the study by calling the scan a selfie game, and hid the fact that the phone that the subjects were playing with was taking scans of their faces. While the intention was to collect more representative data, this obviously was not an ethical way to do so. Another issue is that in some cases, unbiased data might not even exist. Take the US criminal justice system, for example. It's an institution that was built on the basis of systemic racism, and its data reflects that. The data is inherently biased, and that same data is what is fed to the predictive policing tools and to the algorithms that help judges decide sentences, as we discussed before. In these cases, it's virtually impossible to train these algorithms using unbiased data because that data just doesn't exist within the institution. Another concern is essentially human error. Engineers themselves can have implicit biases. They are the people that are in charge of designing, testing, and deploying the software, and they may make fundamentally biased assumptions. For example, an engineer could decide that a tool works fairly on all women, when in reality it works fairly on white women, but not black women. The engineers checking the tools for bias need to have a solid understanding of how bias operates, and the fact that the AI sector consists primarily of white men makes this pretty hard to achieve. To summarize, algorithmic bias describes systematic and repeatable errors in a computer system that create unfair outcomes like privileging or excluding based on race, gender, and religion, and it serves to perpetuate existing inequalities and prejudices. There's no simple technological solution for eliminating the inequalities that exist in data because these inequalities predate computing itself. On a more positive note, the best we can hope for right now is transparency from the companies that create these algorithms about the data that they use and how they train their systems and about how fair and accurate their algorithms are. Thanks for listening.